Senator DeMint came and talked to me just a short time ago to tell me what he was going to do. I've read his book, he's read my book, we're friends. We spent a half hour within the past week talking about the Senate. At that time, I didn't know that he was considering leaving. I'm not sure that he had made a decision at that time. I rather doubt it. But I've always liked the guy. And even though I disagree with so much of what he's done, I appreciate that I personally believe he does this out of a sense of real belief. It's not political posturing for him as it is for a lot of people. So I like Jim DeMint. I wish him well.
I want to take a moment to take you back a few years, 10 to be exact. A decade ago, in 2003, Mike Pence of Indiana and I were just starting out our second terms as members of the United States House of Representatives. Jim DeMint was beginning his third and final term in the House, and he was really starting to make waves in Washington after spending several years carefully laying the groundwork of a large grassroots campaign for a renewed commitment to conservative principles. When Jim, Mike, and I all returned to Washington in January 2003, after having won re-election that past November, we found ourselves to be more than just fellow members of the House. We were neighbors too. Our offices were all in the same corridor of the Cannon Building, 3 members, all consistently ranked and judged as among the most conservative voices at the House at that time, were all housed in the same marble wing, a stone's throw from one another, in a hallway made of stone. Party leadership in the House doesn't play a role in assigning member offices, but you can bet that at the time they were wishing they had been able to keep us further apart. A corridor of DeMint, Pence, and Flake, in so close together, able to confer on a bill or an amendment or a strategy at a moment's notice, spelled trouble for the powers that were.
Senator DeMint was an example to me from long before I decided to run for the United States Senate. In fact, his example was one of the things that motivated and inspired me to get into the Senate race to begin with. His long-standing example of conservative leadership, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, was an inspiration to so many people. And he gave hope to so many people who understand that if we focus more on the constitutional restraints of the federal government, if we focus on limiting the size and the scope and the cost of the federal government, we'll all benefit as a result.
I first started thinking about running for the U.S. Senate in January 2010, shortly after the Senate passed Obamacare. To help me evaluate my decision, our county Republican chairwoman had suggested I go to an Americans for Prosperity event being held in the Wisconsin Dells one weekend in March. On my drive to the AFP event, I was listening to talk radio and heard Glenn Beck interview Senator Jim DeMint. They were talking about the enormous challenges facing our nation and how America needed good men and women willing to serve in Congress. I will never forget how Jim described the type of individual he wanted to see run for Senate. He said he was looking for people who would come to Washington wanting to join the fight, not the club.
When Jim got to the Senate, the easy thing for him to have done would have been to simply go along and get along, to not make much noise, to keep a low profile, and to just get very comfortable in a job he could have had for as long as he wanted it. But that wasn't Jim DeMint. Jim was too devoted to the principles at the heart of our great party and this great republic, the principles of limited government and personal freedom, individual responsibility, and a free enterprise system. And Jim DeMint understands how important those principles are. So Jim wasn't willing to just go along and get along. He insisted on standing up for those principles. Now that had some number of effects. One of the things it did was it made life uncomfortable for Jim with some of his colleagues. There were some people who would prefer the old way and didn't really want to have to adhere to the principles that they may advocate. There's another effect that it had, and that was in 2009 and 2010. Jim DeMint's consistent, principled, conservative leadership helped to really energize and guide a whole movement across the country.
In the end, I decided to run for the U.S. Senate because I knew people like Jim DeMint needed allies. We still do.
His early support in my campaign was instrumental to my victory in Utah. And once I arrived here in the Senate, it was Jim DeMint who welcomed me here and made me feel part of the crowd. I sometimes really admired his South Carolina accent, and on many occasions, not just the accent, but all the friends that he has with him from his home state of South Carolina caused me to experience what I call South Carolina envy.
The net effect of these things was that Jim DeMint played a huge role in changing the face of the United States Senate. Jim played a huge role in helping people like me get elected and take Arlen Specter's seat. Mike Lee, who was elected in Utah, Ted Cruz in Texas, Jeff Flake in Arizona, and others. It's quite possible that none of us would have been elected if it hadn't been for Jim DeMint's consistent, principled leadership as the solid conservative that he was. And because he was willing to make himself personally uncomfortable with many of his colleagues, because he was willing to make that personal sacrifice for a cause that he believed in, he has changed the face of the United States Senate. Well, we're certainly not perfect, but we Republicans in the Senate are far more conservative today, and I think will be going forward, than we would have been had it not been for the principled and courageous leadership of Jim DeMint. For that, I'll always be grateful, and I just want to say, thanks, Jim.
I sometimes think back to that conservative corridor. Jim, Mike, and me, all together. We've all moved forward toward bigger responsibilities. But only 10 years after we were neighbors, after 8 in the Senate, and now as Heritage's president, Jim has helped to create a much larger conservative corridor, one that spans from shore to shore. During his time as a senator, in between challenging earmark after earmark on the Senate floor, fighting to replace the tax code and repeal Obamacare, Jim carefully, precisely, and strategically helped recruit more conservatives to fill corridors in the Senate. Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, Senator Ted Cruz, your keynote speaker, Mike Lee of Utah, and me, among others. I'm especially grateful to Jim for all he did to make my campaign achieve the victory that we did. Jim has been quoted many times as saying, "I would rather have 30 Republicans in the Senate who believe in principles of freedom than 60 who don't." Even though Republicans are in the minority in the Senate Republican Conference is anchored by conservatives, largely because of Jim's efforts. He made it clear that his commitment was to keeping the ideals of freedom, opportunity, and prosperity strong in the Senate halls.
He is a man of faith, humility, courage, and principle. My life has been enriched knowing him, and the prospects are brighter for America's future because of his dedicated service.
Jim's fervent goal as president of Heritage, I quote, is to make conservative ideas so pervasive, so persuasive across the country that politicians of all parties have to embrace those ideals just to be elected. I have no doubt that with your help, with the help of your leadership, Jim, the conservative corridor that you helped to build will be so strong and so vast that politicians will in the future be able to act based on what is both proper and right. Thank you, Jim, for all you've done to strengthen our country, from the Palmetto State to the Grand Canyon State and beyond. Now, onward.